Okay, so for empiricism, it's mostly Locke and Berkeley, you know. Now, you know, what I said was the way that Descartes tried to get us out of skepticism. I'm not going to ask you a lot on this, was to basically look at the one example of a true truth he has, the cogito ergo sum, and say, well, what were the characteristics of this statement that marked it out as necessarily true, as true beyond doubt? And he uses what Richard Rorty has called visual metaphor. He says it's clarity and distinctness. And I said a good way of understanding what he says is take a look at the projection here. It's more or less in focus, and so the letters are clear, and because they're clear, they're also distinct from one another. And you can read what's going on there easily, whereas if the projector were out of focus, then you would have the letters not being clear and bleeding into one another, and so they wouldn't be distinct from one another. And so where he goes from here is kind of a roundabout way of proceeding. Because remember, he does not want to end up a skeptic. Descartes does not go into this project to prove skepticism, but to give us a rational basis for knowledge in philosophy and the sciences. So Descartes says, well, do I have any other ideas or concepts that have the same mark of necessary truth? And he comes up with his innate idea of God. And we saw what his innate idea of God was when we looked at Descartes' version of the ontological argument earlier in the semester, that God is the sum of all perfect qualities. He's all-powerful, all-knowing, but also omnibenevolent, merciful, morally perfect. And so Descartes says, look, and what he does is he uses the ontological argument for God, which we already saw. He cannot use the design argument or the argument from first cause, the cosmological argument, because both of those depend on observations about the world. So he's got to use an abstract argument, and he uses more than one, but the main one is the ontological argument. So Descartes tries to prove the existence of God, and of a God who has all perfect qualities and is not going to deceive us. Descartes says, well, you know, if God made me such that I think that, say, there's a real book bag on that table and there wasn't, or that I think there's a real monitor in front of me and there wasn't, it's either all a dream or I'm being deceived by some evil genius, then Descartes says, in some sense, God would not be morally perfect. He would be a deceiver. So, to prove the existence of a God who's no deceiver, then he uses this argument. And so, if God is no deceiver, then I must be right when I think that there are real tables and chairs in this room. And so the way he gets back our confidence in the material world and what our senses perceive, and what mathematics tells us about them, is basically saying that if God is no deceiver, we can trust our senses. So this is a roundabout way of doing things. But the problem is, later later philosophers, the empiricists, could not choose Descartes' way out of skepticism, in part because it depended on innate knowledge, innate ideas, like his supposedly innate idea of God. And for the empiricists, when we come into this world, our minds are not filled with knowledge like Plato and Socrates thought, or like Descartes thought. Plato and Socrates thought we acquired this knowledge in a previous life. The later Christian rationalists, who did not believe in reincarnation, said, no, God puts this knowledge into us at birth. And we call this having innate ideas. But for Locke and the empiricists, when we come into this world, our mind is a tabula rasa, a blank tablet. And it's only after we're born that it gets filled with knowledge. So the empiricists could not take Descartes' way out of skepticism because, in part, it depended on having innate ideas. But it also was a big piece of circular reasoning that assumed rather than proved what it was supposed to prove. Because if you say, well, Descartes, how do I know that statements that I perceive clearly and distinctly are necessarily true? Descartes would say, well, there's a God who is no deceiver who guarantees that statements you perceive clearly and distinctly are necessarily true. And if I should press him more and say, yeah, but Descartes, how do I know that a God exists and he's no deceiver? Descartes would say, well, I can prove the existence of God from my necessarily true, clear and distinct ideas. So that reasoning goes in one big circle, and it's called the Cartesian circle. So the empiricists ultimately, because they couldn't take Descartes' way out of skepticism and did not have one of their own, British empiricism ended up in the skepticism of David Hume. So we saw a little of Hume's skepticism when we saw his arguments against the design argument. But Locke and Berkeley were going in that direction because for Locke, all their things have primary and secondary properties, but only the primary are real in the world as we experience it. Descartes put us in what was called the egocentric predicament. And it's this assumption that leads down the garden path to skepticism. Because once you claim that the mind is never acquainted with anything at a distance, that the only thing the mind is acquainted with is its own inner experiences, then you have the problem of trying to show that those experiences, like the experience we have where we think that our perception of that desk over there is really caused in us by a real material desk in the real world. We're going to see that the problem is that you can't get beyond your inner experiences to compare them with the world to see if they're accurate. And this led to the skepticism of Hume, but both Locke and Berkeley were going in that direction. So on the test, there's not going to be anything on Hume, but on Locke and Berkeley. So Locke says that there are no innate ideas. Now, he didn't just make this claim. He devoted a whole book of his essay concerning human understanding to arguing against the belief in innate ideas. So the mind's a tabula rasa, blank tablet. And what writes on the tablet, and I'm beginning to take this thing in order, is basically our experience. So, for the empiricists, all of our knowledge comes from experience. We don't have any innate knowledge at birth. So Locke defines an idea, and look, for the empiricists, an idea is a technical term. They have their own specific concept of what an idea is. And an idea for them is basically what the mind is immediately acquainted with. It's an immediate object of perception. The mind perceives only ideas, not directly anything in the external world for the empiricists. So Locke defines an idea as whatever is the object of the understanding when a man thinks, when a human being thinks. In other words, whatever we experience is experienced as an idea. And I already said his opinion of innate knowledge, innate ideas, is that there is none. So sensation and reflection are the two sources of our ideas from experience. Sensation, under that category, are all the observations that we make about things in the external world. The ideas we get about things external to us come to us via sensation. Reflection means reflection on the operations of our own minds. In other words, they thought that we could introspect into our own thoughts and discover some knowledge about how the mind worked and about what its capacities were. And Descartes started us in this direction. So at any rate, now we saw that another distinction that's important here for ideas is the distinction between simple and complex ideas. Basically, complex ideas are built up out of simple ideas. But usually our experience is of a complex idea, like the complex idea of the properties that make up the whiteboard over there, or that make up the projector or a desk. And so what we experience, and in the PowerPoint we have an example of a telephone, what we experience as an external object can be broken down into its various properties, its shape, its size, the number of objects we're experiencing, the color, whether it has tactile sensations, whether it feels warm or cold to the touch. So all of these individual qualities and the ideas that relate to them are simple ideas, but when we put them all together, we get a complex idea of what we call a material object. So this is important because for us, a material object, as we experience it, is just a complex putting together of these simple ideas into a complex idea. So again, be able to recognize examples of each. Well, a complex idea would be like an idea of, say, a desk or a telephone, and a simple idea would be an idea of the separate properties of a thing. So Locke's view, see, among other things, these people did not think that there was anything like action at a distance, causality at a distance. So they're saying whatever the mind experiences can't be some distant object. In other words, the common sense view is that when I look at the projector over there, the experience I have of perceiving that projector comes from the mind being acquainted with a distant object in the room. But for the empiricist, the mind is only acquainted with its internal representations of a distant object. Now, which again are ideas. So for Locke, though, some of these ideas, the ideas of primary qualities, resemble the qualities as they are in the world. In other words, I have an idea of that whiteboard out there in the world as having a rectangular shape. And so he would say, they would say that I would never have thought to do something like that in college. Would never have occurred to people in my generation to get out of a college class and just walk. I know it's done routinely around here, which is part of what's wrong with higher education nowadays. Anyway, what Locke is saying is my internal picture of that whiteboard is of a rectangular object. In other words, that I have an internal rectangular image that resembles the real rectangular shape of that board as it is in the real world. So Locke thinks that our senses do give us accurate knowledge of the primary properties of things, but the secondary ones, things like colors, taste, smells, he says, are subjective and in us. They're caused by the primary, but so in other words, color is not in the whiteboard, right? That might be what we call it, but the object as it is out there in the world does not have color of any kind. Well, this is called indirect or representative realism because Locke defends the claim that we're in a real world with real objects that exist whether we perceive them or not, but he thinks that we only know them through representative images. As I said, if a lot of us have never seen the president, but if he walked into the room, we think we'd recognize him. Why? Because we've seen a lot of representative images of him. And so that's how we get knowledge for Locke. We have immediate contact with our inner ideas, but they genuinely represent real qualities of things out there in the world as far as the primary properties are concerned. Now, the problem with this is that Locke can never get behind his ideas to confirm his belief that they really do represent and resemble properties in the world. So Locke ultimately could not defend this kind of realism because if you never can get beyond your immediate, the ideas that you immediately experience, to compare them with the world, you can never tell whether they represent the world accurately or, and what's relevant for Berkeley is whether they represent anything at all. Whether all we have are the ideas. So this skepticism did not sit well with the very religious George Berkeley. And again, you think of Berkeley as being, an old guy, but when he wrote his best stuff, he was about 20 years old. And Berkeley thought that this belief that a material world exists, independently of our perceptions of it, can, if you give people that belief, Berkeley is worried that it leads in the minds of some people to full-blown materialism. In other words, if you give people the belief that a material world does exist independently of us, Berkeley is worried that people will be led to the conclusion that only a material world exists, that there's no such thing as immaterial substance or mind. So Berkeley tried to get out of philosophy where everything that exists is immaterial. He tried to disprove the existence of a material world. Now, the view that all that exists is ultimately mental is what we call idealism or immaterialism. And Berkeley's whole philosophy, as you see there, again, I'm kind of taking this, can be summed up in the words esse est percipi. Now, for Locke, the secondary qualities like colors were subjective and in us. They didn't accurately represent anything that's a property of something in the external world. Berkeley agreed with Locke about all these secondary properties. He thought they're subjective and mind-dependent. This word mind-dependent means dependent on a mind for its existence. Now, a lot of sensations, like a sensation of pain, are obviously, like I'm having back pain now due to that accident. A lot of sensations obviously depend on having a perceiving mind there to experience them in order for the sensation itself to exist. I mean, it would make no sense if this were an empty room to say, but nonetheless there's a pain wandering around, a back pain wandering around in an empty room unperceived. But if you can understand that in order for a pain to exist, it has to be experienced by a mind or a perceiver, that is, its existence is dependent on a mind, well, you can understand where Berkeley goes, because for him, all of the ideas, the sensations that we have of other properties of things, like their extension in space, their color, their size, their weight, their number. For Berkeley, all of these properties are in the same category with pains. That is, these properties cannot exist independently of a mind. So for Berkeley, then, that's how he gets to the claim esse est percipi. To be is to be perceived by some mind or other. Now, there are some experiences and ideas that are only in our minds. If I imagine a horse, that's an idea that's subject to my will and only in my mind. But for Berkeley, there are other ideas that we have that are not under our control. In other words, it's not subject to me that that's my phone in my pocket. That's okay. It can stay there. I usually don't put it on vibrate class because I don't get that many calls. I think this is probably a robo sales call. If I get more than 2 calls in a row from any number and nobody leaves a message, after the third one, I automatically kick it out to the auto reject list. So that's what I will do with that number. Nobody leaves a message. Okay, so back to this. So then for Berkeley, what we experience as a material object is just a combination of its ideas. And all of these ideas are mental, either from our own minds or, for Berkeley, caused in us directly by God, not by independently existing material objects. So Berkeley's afraid that if people think that a material world exists independently of us, they can be led to the further conclusion that only a material world exists, and they can cut God out of the picture. But for Berkeley's philosophical view, you can't cut God out of the picture because God's causing ideas in us that that are not subject to our will. In other words, this audio-visual desk in front of me is just a complicated group of ideas for Berkeley that are directly caused in me by God. So, you know, the thing is, Johnstone tried to refute Berkeley by going over and kicking a stone and said, "Berkeley, I refute thee thus." But it's not a refutation of Berkeley, because for Berkeley, everything we experience will still be as it is, even if everything is mental. Things will still be as heavy as they are when you try to lift them up. They'll still be as hard as they are. They'll still be as, clearly perceived as they are. But everything is mental. So that's Berkeley's view. And the point is, he's led to this by this assumption that, it's 10:50, that the mind directly perceives only its ideas. Okay, we do have official class on Monday. That's the last class day. And I'll do a little review on utilitarianism. And we're going to try to get your papers back to you on that. Thank you for coming. If anyone missed the roll, it's up here. So sign it on the way out.